Imagine the night of July 18th, 1918 in the remote Ural Mountains. A gentle light is extinguished. An Orthodox nun and former princess, Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna of Russia, a granddaughter of Britain's Queen Victoria and the beloved sister of the last Russian empress, is brutally murdered by Bolshevik zealots. Having spent her life in service to others, she dies praying and comforting her fellow captives as she is thrown alive into an abandoned mine shaft. Her story, from royal splendor to selfless martyrdom, is one of the most dramatic in the final chapter of Imperial Russia. This video will trace Elisabeth's remarkable journey. Her upbringing as Princess Elisabeth of Hesse, her marriage and devotion to Russia, her philanthropy and spiritual transformation after her husband's assassination, and finally, her arrest, exile, and brutal death during the Revolution. Elisabeth Alexandra Louise Alice, Ella to her family, was born on November 1st, 1864 in Besunken, in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, now part of Germany. She was the second daughter of Louis IV, Grand Duke of Hesse, and his consort, Princess Alice, the second daughter of Queen Victoria. This made Elisabeth a granddaughter of Queen Victoria and a niece of the future British King Edward VII. From birth, she was surrounded by European royalty on all sides. Within her family, she was known simply as Ella, a beautiful and gentle child, nurtured in the devout, charitable Lutheran faith of her mother. Despite this privileged upbringing, Elisabeth's childhood was marked by tragedy and hardship. The Hessian court was uncommonly serious and low-key. Her mother Alice insisted that all the children learn to do household tasks and to share with the poor. Alice frequently took little Elisabeth and her sisters to visit hospitals and help the needy, lessons that instilled compassion in the young princess. In 1873, the family was devastated when Elisabeth's haemophiliac baby brother, Friedrich, Fritti, fell from a window and died from head injuries. Years later, in 1878, a diphtheria epidemic swept through the family. Elisabeth's sister Marie and her mother Alice both succumbed to the disease within weeks, leaving the 10-year-old Elisabeth an orphan of her mother. Of all her siblings, only Elisabeth herself avoided illness that fall. She later recalled returning to her grieving family after weeks away, describing the scene as terribly sad, no one daring to speak, as they mourned. These early losses hardened Elisabeth's character. She observed her mother praying over her children's sickness and learned that life could be fragile. By her teenage years, Elisabeth had grown into a strikingly beautiful and graceful young woman. Contemporary accounts praised her exquisite features and gentle demeanour. She caught the eye of many suitors in Europe, including a youthful cousin, the future Kaiser Wilhelm II, but Elisabeth showed no interest in them. Instead, she and her surviving sisters were allowed unusual freedom to choose their own paths. Queen Victoria deliberately refused to pressure them into political matches. This spirit of independence would eventually lead Elisabeth across Europe into the highest echelons of Russian royalty. In 1884, at age 19, Elisabeth's life took a decisive turn. She married Grand Duke Sergei Alexandrovich of Russia, a first cousin once removed. Her paternal grandfather was Sergei's grandfather, and the fifth son of Emperor Alexander II. The wedding, held on the 15th of June 1884 at the Winter Palace in St. Petersburg, brought the young German princess into the heart of the Russian imperial family. By law, she took the name Elisaveta Feodorovna and the Orthodox faith of her husband, though in fact she voluntarily converted later, embracing Orthodoxy of her own choice. Elisabeth had arrived in Russia as a Lutheran princess, but soon plunged herself into learning about Russian culture and religion. As one chronicler noted, the religion of Russia captured her with its beauty, and she ultimately chose to become Orthodox out of sincere devotion. Sergei Alexandrovich was not the groom Elizabeth's grandmother, the famously anti-Russian Queen Victoria, would have chosen, but the match gradually proved successful. Elizabeth and Sergey had known each other in childhood and, after some initial hesitation, fell deeply in love. They lived mainly in Russia, where Sergey would serve as a close advisor to Tsar Alexander III and later as Governor-General of Moscow. Elizabeth became known at court for her dignity and grace, a true Christian wife, as one observer put it. She and Sergey did not have biological children, but their home at Ilyanskoye, a country estate near Moscow, was always full of children nonetheless. They happily adopted and fostered Sergey's orphaned niece and nephew, Grand Duke Dmitry Pavlovich and Grand Duchess Maria Pavlovna. There, the Grand Duchess of Moscow held elaborate parties for children and maintained a lively household on what was no longer an autochthonous Russian family estate. Yet even as an imperial princess, Elizabeth felt her husband was her window on Russia. She once said that she had dissolved herself in him, learning about Russian life through his eyes. As the Governor-General's wife in the 1890s and early 1900s, Elizabeth translated that closeness into active charity. During the Russo-Japanese War, she led a massive relief effort. Thousands of women from noble and common backgrounds gathered in the Kremlin to sew bandages, knit garments, and prepare care packages for wounded soldiers at the front. The opulent gilded halls of the Kremlin were, for the duration of the war, turned into bustling workshops and hospitals under her direction. Wealthy ladies of society joined simpler working women in this effort, unified by Elizabeth's leadership. In all these ways, and in her everyday visits to schools and hospitals, she quietly laid the groundwork for the deeper devotion to service that would soon define her life. Not all of Sergey's reign was peaceful. In fact, as a royal reactionary, he made many enemies. By modern standards, he was a hardliner even by imperial measures. As Governor-General of Moscow, he supported repressive measures and was involved in the mass expulsions of Moscow's Jewish population in the 1890s. A drastic anti-Semitic policy that Stalin-era scholars now condemn. This harsh reputation made him an early target of revolutionary anger. On the 17th of February 1905, Julian calendar, a young socialist revolutionary named Ivan Kalyaev hurled a bomb at Sergey's carriage as the Grand Duke was walking through the Kremlin grounds. The explosion blew Sergey's body apart. One arm was reportedly thrown yards away in a gruesome scene. Elizabeth rushed to her husband's side immediately. Contemporary eyewitnesses describe her collapsing on her knees among the carnage and later gathering what remained of his body with her own hands. Overcome with grief, she famously refused to weep until late that afternoon, maintaining composure amid the shock. Later, she was said to have whispered, "He belonged entirely to God," foreshadowing her next steps. Even as her own world had torn apart, Elizabeth reacted not with revenge, but with extraordinary Christian mercy. She insisted on visiting Kalyaev in prison. Bearing a gilded New Testament, she confronted her husband's assassin with compassion. "Why did you kill him?" she asked. When Kalyaev, bruised and with the bomb on his person, said he could not bear the sight of her husband if she had been in the carriage instead, she still replied, "You did not understand that by killing him, you were killing me." She urged him to read the gospel she left with him, hoping for repentance. Though touched by her humility, Kalyaev stubbornly refused to repent. Undeterred, Elizabeth then petitioned her nephew, Tsar Nicholas II, Sergey's nephew, to grant the bomber clemency. The emperor refused. He believed revolutionary terrorists could not be forgiven. And so Ivan Kalyaev was hanged later that year. The episode made Elizabeth famous across Russia for her saintly forgiveness, even as it broke her heart. In the wake of Sergei's death, Elisabeth made a radical life change. The luxurious, gilded existence of the imperial court felt alien to her grief. She began to divest herself of worldly wealth, selling her jewellery and adopting a very simple diet of milk, bread, and vegetables. In 1905, she withdrew from society, and in 1909, formally took religious vows, renouncing her title to become a nun, taking the name Mother Elisabeth. With her inheritance and whatever funds she could muster, she founded a convent in downtown Moscow, the convent of Saints Martha and Mary, dedicated to caring for the poor and sick. As abbess, she lived in 3 small rooms on the convent grounds, praying and ministering to the needy. Her one luxury was a small library, otherwise she immersed herself in spiritual reading and charity work. The palace life was over. She now wore a simple nun's habit and began what she called her ascent to Golgotha, the hill of suffering. Saints Martha and Mary of Bethany, from the Gospel story of Jesus at Lazarus's home, became the model for Elisabeth's new mission. Martha and Mary are famously the sister who serves and the sister who contemplates. Likewise, Elisabeth's Moscow convent was both a cloister for prayer and a centre of active mercy. The Grand Duchess abbess poured her days into organisations that provided concrete help to the impoverished and sick. With the aid of many upper-class Russian women who joined as novice nuns or workers, Elisabeth opened free hospitals, orphanages, and dispensaries. She personally tended the beds of the ill and cleaned their wounds. She walked among the poor in the slums to wash, dress, and feed them. World War I tested Russia as never before, and Elisabeth's small empire of mercy expanded to meet the need. Sisters from her convent staffed field hospitals and Red Cross units. They fed and clothed war widows and orphans. As one biographer noted, from morning to night, during the war, Moscow's great halls were filled with working women under Elisabeth's direction, sewing uniforms, raising funds, and caring for the countless wounded. She was active on the home front just as much as she had been during the Russo-Japanese War. No aristocrat had ever cast off privilege so completely. Even before taking formal vows, Elisabeth insisted on radical simplicity. She ate only vegetarian meals, dressed plainly, and disavowed the luxurious accommodations given to her as Grand Duchess. She encouraged her sisters to do the same. In every charity hospital and soup kitchen she visited, people from the lowest classes came to know the former princess as a gentle nun who called them brother and sister. In the eyes of ordinary Muscovites, she became Matyona, Mother Elisabeth, a saintly figure surrounded by miracles of kindness. Her reputation among the public stood in stark contrast to her late husband's legacy. While Sergei's name was remembered for repression and anti-Jewish violence, Elisabeth's name became synonymous with mercy. Church officials and biographers noted that she earned the most sincere love in Russia through her tireless work for the poor. Even skeptics admired her sincerity. One wartime newspaper remarked that it was hard to see how she could pose any danger to Soviet power, given that her only weapon had been a love for the sick and suffering. In this way, Elisabeth Feodorovna quietly reversed the scandals around her family name by embodying Christ's command to love thy neighbour to the utmost. Not everyone in imperial society embraced Elisabeth's transformation. Some conservative nobles muttered that a duchess should not live as a pauper, and in the xenophobic atmosphere of World War I, her German birth occasionally aroused suspicion. Anti-German sentiment in Russia was high, and even foreign-born nobility were eyed warily. Though her sisters had married into German and British royal families, Elisabeth disdained politics and hated the murderous revolutionaries, so there is no evidence she ever sided with Germany. She remained loyal to Russia and to her adopted Orthodox faith. If there was criticism, it mostly came from the pricks of envy. Seeing a high-born woman renounce luxury for soup kitchens, some courtiers must have felt ashamed of themselves. By and large, however, the people regarded her as a living saint. In patriotic memoirs of the 1910s, she is described not as a dangerous German but as a mother for the needy, someone who had left her royal trappings to feed orphans and soldiers' children. In the eyes of Russia's poor, she had become one of their own. Of course, as the elder sister of Empress Alexandra Feodorovna, née Princess Alex of Hesse, Elisabeth remained close to the imperial family. She and her sister shared deep religious convictions, and they wrote to each other faithfully even after Nicholas II fell in 1917. In 1916, the two sisters met for the last time, their bond strengthened by prayer. Yet the sisters' fates would tragically intertwine in the coming revolution. The world that Elisabeth had served was swept away in 1917. The February Revolution that year forced the abdication of Emperor Nicholas II, Elizabeth's brother-in-law, ending centuries of Romanov rule. In the months of upheaval that followed, life in Elizabeth's convent in Moscow was at first scarcely disturbed. Local Bolshevik officials initially left Mother Elizabeth alone, even as they expropriated churches and royal palaces. She continued to run her hospitals and soup kitchens throughout 1917, unaware that the new regime would soon consider all Romanovs guilty by association. As the civil war intensified in early 1918, the Bolshevik government decided to round up the remaining Romanovs. Mother Elizabeth understood the danger. Her whole family, including the Tsars, was now outlawed. On May 7, 1918, shortly after the Orthodox Easter, Bolshevik troops entered her convent and placed her under arrest. The newspaper Novy Vechernyi Chas, at the time, wondered why someone as gentle as Elisabeth could be expelled, speculating that it was a proud gesture against Wilhelm, her German-born relatives. Whatever the pretext, the Christian abbess was loaded onto a train. By May 11th, she had been transported to Yekaterinburg, then called Ekaterinburg, in the Urals. There, by coincidence, the former imperial family itself was imprisoned nearby. For 9 days, Mother Elizabeth and her novice, Varnitsa, nun, Sister Varvara Yakovleva, lived in the same city as Nicholas II, but the sisters never saw each other. During that time, 14 Romanovs gathered in town. Elisabeth found herself unexpectedly sharing Atamanovsky Nomera, a Yekaterinburg hotel, with a handful of dukes and duchesses. Their neighbours were fellow captives, Grand Duke Sergey Mikhailovich, a cousin of the Tsar, the young poet Duke Vladimir Paley, Princes Igor, Konstantin, Ioan, John, Konstantinovich, and even the family's secretary. All of them, nobles who once commanded palaces, were now quietly living in one large room under armed guard. Mother Elizabeth tended the wounded and prayed, organising a rudimentary hospital in their corridors as best she could. They even planted a small vegetable garden, trying to restore some normalcy amid captivity. In late May 1918, the Bolsheviks began moving these prisoners deeper into the Urals. On May 20th, 1918, Elisabeth and her fellow detainees were transferred to Alapaevsk, a mining town about 120 miles north of Yekaterinburg. There they were confined in an abandoned schoolhouse, under ever stricter guard. For a few tense weeks they lived in uneasy limbo. Guarded day and night, they passed the time quietly. Mother Elizabeth would brush the hair of the Tsar's nieces, pray with them, sing hymns in her soft voice, and try to comfort young children who had no idea what was to come. Each morning she knelt to wash the weary feet of her Romanov cousins and to kiss their hands. Through it all, she held onto a small icon of Christ that Archbishop Alexander blessed her with on the day of her Orthodox baptism long ago. A reminder of her faith as Bolshevik soldiers fetched her breakfast trays in silence. By mid-July 1918, the White Army was advancing from the south, and the local Bolshevik authorities panicked. In Ekaterinburg, Lenin's men murdered the Tsar and his immediate family on July 17th. Old calendar. News of this was only starting to filter out. The next morning, July 18th, 1918, dawned as a terrible day for the remaining Romanovs. In the early hours, some accounts say around dawn, the Bolsheviks loaded Mother Elisabeth and 5 of the other captives onto carts. They took them out to a desolate spot outside Alapaevsk, the mine that served as a makeshift execution site. According to time-honoured accounts, the prisoners were blindfolded and bound, then told they were being flown by airplane to Tyumen for safety. In reality, when they arrived at the mine shaft, the guards told them a bridge had been bombed and they should dismount. As the bewildered aristocrats walked on, the Bolsheviks threw grenades and pushed them into the pit. Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna was reportedly the first to be thrown in. The shaft was about 20 metres, 65 feet, deep and partly filled with brackish water. As one witness later testified, Elisabeth fell in head first, injuring herself badly on the way down. Despite her injuries, she managed to clamber onto a ledge. From there, she could hear the others, aunts, uncles, and children of the imperial dynasty, also falling into the dark. After the initial explosion, the Bolsheviks lobbed grenades to finish them off. The prisoners still alive at the bottom of the pit were left in complete darkness, isolated and half-submerged. In those final moments, the Grand Duchess's character shone most brightly. Traditional accounts say that she used scraps of her clothing to tend to the wounded around her, as best she could. Remarkably, amidst the horror, she began to pray out loud and sing hymns. Some reports, though contested, say she sang Phos Hilaron, O Gladsome Light, as a lullaby for the dying. Certainly, witnesses later testified to hearing hymns from the shaft, even after the grenades, before a guard stuffed logs on top and set them alight. The most enduring memory is that of Mother Elisabeth's unwavering faith. On that rocky ledge, wounded and trapped, she comforted the others, particularly Sister Varvara, with psalms and gentle words. When the Bolsheviks finally left, believing all had perished, they climbed back into their carts. Months later, in October 1918, White Army forces reaching Alapaevsk recovered the bodies of the victims. Despite the flames and time underwater, Grand Duchess Elisabeth's body, and those of the others, were found remarkably intact. She had died from her injuries, not drowning, exhausted by the fall. The remains were placed in simple coffins and taken by white sympathizers on a long journey east, to Irkutsk, then across Asia to China, and finally carried by steamer to the Mediterranean. In April 1920, Elizabeth's only surviving sister, Victoria, Queen Marie of Romania's mother, arranged for her remains to be interred with dignity at the Church of Mary Magdalene in Jerusalem. Thus, the woman who had sacrificed her royal life for Christ found her final rest in the Holy Land. Grand Duchess Elisabeth Feodorovna was not forgotten. To many Russian Orthodox believers, she had already lived as a saint in her humility and charity. Martyrdom only sealed that conviction. As the Iron Curtain fell and new scholarship emerged, the Russian Orthodox Church officially recognized her sanctity. In 1981, the Russian Orthodox Church outside Russia, the Émigré Church in Exile, canonized her as a holy new martyr. In 1992, the Moscow Patriarchate similarly glorified her, with the entire imperial family, as a saint. Today she is commemorated liturgically as Saint Elizabeth the New Martyr, with her feast on July 5th, the day of her death. Her relics at the Jerusalem Church have become an object of devotion. Orthodox pilgrims venerate the marble sarcophagus that holds her remains at Gethsemane, often noting that the body was reported to be incorrupt, a sign of holiness in the tradition. In Moscow, the convent of Saints Martha and Mary endures as a living memorial to her life. It continues to run a free hospital and charitable programs in the name of Saint Elisabeth, linking the present to her legacy of mercy. Even in secular memory, Elizabeth's story resonates. She has become a symbol of self-sacrifice and forgiveness, a princess who traded a crown for a cross, as one modern writer put it. Her life and death are recounted in numerous histories of the Romanovs and in many eyewitness accounts of the Revolution. During her lifetime, she was admired as the embodiment of Christian charity. After her death, as a martyr who offered compassion in the face of cruelty. In summary, Grand Duchess Elisabeth Fyodorovna's journey from royalty to renunciation is extraordinary. Born into luxury as a German princess and Romanov by marriage, she became famous not for power, but for humility. When her beloved husband was killed by terrorists, she answered with grace and charity. As a widow turned nun, she cared for Russia's poorest and sickest. And when the revolution came, she did not flee, but faced her captors fearlessly, praying even in death. Canonized as a saint for these very qualities, Elizabeth's life and martyrdom remain a poignant chapter in history, a reminder of faith and forgiveness amid the darkest times.